the webinar provided by Enterprise Solutions Group regarding the upgrading to eBusiness Release 11 and 11G Release 2. So I want to go to the next slide there. Well, my name is Bill Smythe. I'm with Enterprise Solutions Group, and I am an account director for ESG, as we're better known as. And I'll go through the agenda, talk briefly about the presenters, and also a little brief background on Enterprise Solutions Group. So today we'll go through the company profile, we'll do the overview of the upgrade itself, and then we'll go down through the major steps of the upgrade, and then some additional information sharing and considerations, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. We'll open up the phone lines. Again, my name is Bill Smythe, an account director with ESG, and my information is there on the screen, as well as Sean McGuire, who runs our Oracle practice. And joining us as well is Linus Hicks, who is one of our senior DBAs. Real briefly, Enterprise Solutions Group, we've been around since the mid-1990s. We're headquartered in the Fairfax, Virginia area, and we're an Oracle Platinum partner. It's one of the highest levels you can attain being a partner of Oracle's, and we also have specializations around the eBiz financials and the PeopleSoft financials, and that's what we concentrate our efforts on and have for a number of years, is those applications and the technology surrounding that. So we've got extensive experience with implementations and upgrades through many phases, many versions of the Oracle eBiz suite, as well as the PeopleSoft suite. We're a very hands-on company with our executives and our senior project management teams. We work closely with the Oracle teams, both from a regional standpoint as well as the product strategy groups and the development groups. And actually, consistently over the last 4 or 5 years, we have presented at all the major conferences, Oracle Open World, and collaborate. We've been invited by Oracle, presented jointly with them on a number of topics, as well as presenting jointly, which we really like to do with our clients. And we also have a education and change management organization to help our clients in those areas as well.
Okay, with that, this is Sean McGuire, and I'll take over here from Bill, and I'm going to kind of guide us through the rest of the presentation, and Linus will help me as we need. First, I just again want to thank everybody for joining, and we'll begin by talking a little bit about why folks are upgrading, and just to put the context of this, we're really kind of focusing on upgrades that are from Release 11i, 11.5, 10.2 to Release 12.1.3, and going from a 10.2 database to an 11G database, 11.2 11G R2 database. So that's the context within which, if there's at the end, if there's questions around coming from another specific version or other issues, we'll be happy to entertain those as well. But that's kind of the focus of what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. So beginning on why upgrade, there's really 4 or 5 main reasons why. The first one, people would want to pick up some of the new functionality in Release 12. There are several significant areas of change. Probably the most prevalent ones are just the way in which the org structure is implemented, and the fact that the way that subledger accounting handles the accounting for different operating units. You can actually be in more than one operating unit at a time, so you can, in a shared services environment, you can actually, instead of having to switch responsibilities to run payroll payment runs and things like that, you can stay within a single responsibility and run them for more than one at a time. The subledger accounting perspective now, all of the subledgers now, instead of doing in 11i as they do, where they each have their own process to feed the general ledger, to feed their set of books, now what happens is each of the subledger modules share a common process to feed the general ledger, and that process reads the information that the subledger used to produce and then applies rules to create subledger distributions which are stored in a common structure, and then that common structure can be summarized and fed up to the to general ledger, to ledgers now, and the ledgers replace sets of books. Part of that process also allows for, instead of having a single set of books, each one being kind of standalone, now you can have sets of ledgers where you have a primary ledger and one or more potential secondary ledgers, and those can then share how transactions are being processed up, so they can, you can actually represent the same business transaction in more than one set of, what the equivalent from 11i in more than one set of books. So you could be represented in different charts of accounts, in different accounting bases, different calendars, different chart structures. All those things could be different. So that's one of the bigger changes. And another one would be the addition of the eBusiness Suite tax module, so that things like AP can do use tax collection, as well as you know, the regular processing of tax that you had previously with the addition of components in AR for sales tax. So those are just some of the new features that are in R12, and those would be some of the reasons why people might want to go. Next set of reasons have more to do with from a tech stack standpoint, and this is now we're talking about on the middle tier. The 11i tech stack's an older tech stack. We're upgrading the developer tools from 6i to 10G, and you're also moving things like reports from primarily being RDF type reports into BI publisher reports. So that BI publisher report output, it can be generated in many different formats like PDF or into Excel spreadsheets directly, and you can create your own templates to relay out how you want to see the data. So as long as the data is contained in the report itself somewhere, in the SQL extract definition, data definition, it can be organized through any one of a number of templates. So those are some nice things that are available in 12. At the database level, you're also going up. Now you can actually upgrade the database independent, and we'll talk about that a little bit, independent of upgrading the apps by themselves. But as you go to release 11 GR2, you're getting new features at the database level, things like compression at the database. You're getting things like direct NFS. The compression functions actually work quite well, particularly if you have large table structures. We had a customer who had been on Oracle Project Accounting for a number of years, and when we did some testing on their large project tables, which were themselves over a gigabyte in size, we saw compression in the order of like 30 to 1 on those table structures. So there is significant benefit in terms of reducing the amount of space that it takes up, shrinking the amount of time that backups take, and actually in the end for them, since that data was relatively, I'll say relatively static data at that point, it actually generates a performance improvement because the size, the number of data blocks it takes to read the data is significantly lower, and as a result, it more than makes up for the compensation, for the overhead of compressing and uncompressing it when they have to access it. Direct NFS is another nice feature in the database going forward. You can actually have your data files on an NFS file service, especially if you're using a SAN or a NAS in your environment, in a VM environment. These types of features are nice. It removes some of the overhead of the database accessing the data files through the cache of the operating system of the client side of the database server to get to it on the NFS server. And it also allows for parallelization of the I/O, because you can have multiple paths defined for the NFS server. So if you have multiple network channels that get you to your SAN or NAS, you can use all of those channels to facilitate the I/O. So there's a couple things on the tech side. And one of the main reasons we see people end up having to upgrade is just that as their equipment ages, they want to replace it. We have a customer right now that we're working with that is on old HPUX hardware, and they want to get off of that hardware and get onto Intel hardware. So that's an example of a customer where they're looking to migrate to platforms as part of the upgrade process and get to newer, faster, and less expensive equipment And in the process, you can also start to take advantage of some of these other, some of the things like NAS and SAN type storage, flash, SSD, disk, which is faster CPUs in the new servers. And one of the things that we've taken a lot of benefit from ourselves internally, and we find most of our customers do as well, if they can, is implementing virtualization within the, particularly within the development environments. You can typically run many servers, many development servers on as virtual servers within a physical server structure. We internally we find that we're able to run, 3, 4, 5 virtual machines on one physical server, where we used to be getting 1-to-1, or we'd have to try and, we could run more than one environment on the same server, but it would be a more complex configuration because you'd have to worry about multiple Oracle homes and all within the same environment. So this gives you a little bit more flexibility too, because you can move them around from physical server to physical server once they're virtualized, and that makes better use of the hardware. In addition to those points, you get there are other applications which are, which some customers want to take advantage of, which may only be certified with newer versions of the product, newer components from Vertex or from even the Oracle Fusion applications as an example. If you want to link in pieces of the Fusion CRM or the Fusion Accounting Hub, one of those pieces, those components may only be certified with specific versions of the Oracle applications. So it gives you the opportunity to take advantage of more products. And the last, and probably one of the more pertinent reasons to customers, is just to make sure you're staying on a supported platform. And we'll talk more in a minute about the database and the Business Suite certification. But in addition to those two components, the operating system that you're running on and the hardware may be either running out of support or certification, and those areas need to be looked at as well. Now we'll take next we'll take a look at the support structure for from Oracle and where things sit right now. In this graph, we tried to lay out and showing Oracle has its, when you're in normal full support, you're in this green Premier support, and as you can see, if you're on an 11.2 database, you're in full support, and if you're on 12.1 right now, you're in full support. And that's the combination that gets you complete support from Oracle. Everything else right now is on somewhat reduced level of support. So the next level down, which is still pretty relevant support, is the extended support. And right now, as long as you're on release 11, anything of the database, and release 12, you're going to be completely into that extended support. And the way this chart is laid out, the database takes kind of the right-hand side of each column, and the applications take the left-hand side of each column. So what you can see there is that 11.5.10 is still on extended support through November of 2013, and there is a little asterisk next to that saying there's actually some support that goes beyond that, particularly for some HR fixes for payroll and 1099, things like that, that would be continued support until December 2014. But everything else is on is ending its extended support at November 2013, and the database versions are ending their extended support in July of 2013. So if you're still on a 10.2 database, if you're still on a release 10 database, that's something that's going to be coming out of support in July of next year. And so that's something you're going to want to look at upgrading, more urgently than even than the apps for November. And if you're on anything older than that, you're already out of extended support and you're into Oracle's sustaining support, which means you still have access to whatever they've produced on Metalink, but basically they're not doing any other any new bug fixes for you. So that's the support status right now. And so we're looking at customers. If you're from a timeline, a typical upgrade takes anywhere from 6 months to a year to execute, and we're already at the point now in December of 12 where you've got a little bit less than a year to get to November 2013, and you've only got about seven or 8 months to get to the end of July 2013. So we're right at the end of the runway to really start to put together a project to upgrade and stay where the upgrade would be completed within the timeline of staying in the extended support. Next, we're going to walk through the actual steps for doing the upgrade, and we've divided these into 4 major categories. And this is the 4 categories of steps to get you from 11.5.10.2 to 12.1.3. The first thing that you need to look at is making sure that the database has been reorganized into an OATM structure. Now, many people, if they either installed at 11.5.10.2, might already be in that format, but if you came from anything before that and you haven't already done the OATM reorganization, that's one step that would need to be done prior to the upgrade. The next is you want to look at upgrading your database from database to 11G R2. That's the current release. Then after that, we would look at upgrading the applications, and upgrading the applications has to be divided into 2 steps. The first step is getting it upgraded from 11i to 12.1, and the second step is applying the maintenance packs to get you from 12.1 to 12.1.3. The reason why we divide it into these steps is because each of these is can be significant from a time consumption standpoint, depending on the size of your database. The OATM organization, we've had customers where that process all by itself took an entire weekend of an outage to reorganize the database in one shot. And that's for a customer whose database was in the neighborhood of just under 2 terabytes in size for the applications. When you look at upgrading the database, you're talking about not just switching the Oracle homes and applying the patches, but getting the catalog recreated and recompiling all of the invalid objects, and then any of the other technical pieces that need to be regenerated at that point. So that step in and of itself can take anywhere from a few hours to an entire day, depending on the size of the database and the number of objects that have to be upgraded. There's also some considerations about whether you're migrating platforms and staying in a 32-bit environment or moving from a 32-bit environment to a 64-bit environment. So those are things that have to be thought about and considered during that part of the upgrade. And then, like I said, we'll look at the apps pieces and talk about the steps for those. So I guess first, looking at the OATM activity. So this is the Oracle application or automated table space management structure, and in order to migrate to that, Oracle is basically taking us from the old setup where you have usually a data table space and an index table space for each of the applications modules. So you would see GL data, GL index, AP data, AP index, FA data, FA index, on and on for all the modules that you have table structures for. You're moving from that to an organization that is grouped by the way in which the objects, the size of the objects, and the objects' characteristics themselves. So the size of them, their lifespan, whether they're temporary or permanent, the type of access that has them, the locking granularity involved, and the bottom line out of all that is Oracle has created for the applications 12 locally managed table spaces in which each of the objects are mapped. So the result of that is you have to migrate every object in the database from its existing table space into one of these 12 table spaces. And that can be done a little bit at a time, or it can be done all at once. And Oracle does provide some scripting support to facilitate the movement to OATM. The automated scripting component does produce some information about how long it will take, and I think it's actually one of the main things you have to consider when you're going to do this is if you're going to do it in one shot, you may need to have as much as 2 times the data space that your database currently takes up. So if you have a 1 terabyte production database today, and you try to migrate that all in one shot, it's going to start off by creating a new set of table spaces sized appropriately for to move all your data into, which is going to give you 2 times the table spaces in terms of disk space usage. And then it's going to execute the scripts to migrate that from one table space to the other. And that's where we're saying, usually when you're doing this, you see some improvements in the storage. And as a result, if you're moving to something with compression, you may see even more improvements in terms of the amount of storage if you're doing this in an 11 database. And one of the things I didn't mention before, the order in which some of these things happen could be flip-flopped around. You could upgrade to 11 and then move to OATM in terms of the database. But we've chosen this path in order to try and stay within what's most normally supported and where people are. Linus, did you have any other thoughts about the OATM migration?
Yeah, a couple things. I think Sean just mentioned that there are different ways you can do this. The OATM migration can be done prior to the upgrade to release 12, or it can be done as part of. Now, it's also possible that if you may try to do the upgrade prior, and there are some known bugs in that process, depending on some data that you may have, and so you may be essentially forced to do it during the upgrade. There are reports that are provided as part of the conversion scripts that Oracle provides. You can run the report specifying a specific uniform extent size and see what the results would be in terms of the sizing reports that it will produce. If it's a large database, you probably want to pick a larger uniform extent size, perhaps 1 meg or 2 meg or even larger. For a smaller database, you could probably stick with 128K or 256, 512K extent sizes. And again, when as part of running the tool, it will create a script for you that will create your additional table spaces. And you actually have to size those. And it's conceivable. It's not that it could just be up to two times. It could actually be a bit more than twice the space that you need, depending on the extent size that you choose.
Correct. And what? Yeah. So, in the end of that, just the one thing to focus on there is, as Linus said, this is all done. There's scripts provided by Oracle that do this. So you want to download the OATM script setup and run that on your environment to get a feeling for what's going on. You're going to want to do this in your development environment and practice it because, as Linus said, there are some bugs that you can encounter during this process, and you don't want to be doing this in production for the first time when you hit those. And when you're done moving, that'll also give you, if you're doing this in a dev environment that is sized at least in a way that you can kind of scale and estimate what your production is going to be. The timings, you get yourself a baseline timing on it, and you can figure out how big your outage will need to be to do this. So just try and keep in mind things like, how fast is my disk in dev versus how fast is my disk in production, and how fast and how many processors do I have available in my test environment versus production in order to come up with appropriate scaling to give that timeline for your outage in production.
If you're already on 11.5.10, the migration utility is already part of your instance. If you're on a prior release, you'll have to download and apply a patch. But if you're on 11.5.10 or greater, those scripts are already you already have that.
Right, I'm sorry, correct. Okay. Next, talking about upgrade the database to 11G. So this is, there are a couple of different scenarios within the upgrade scenario that you want to think about. One is if you are not migrating your hardware and your OS, meaning if you're already on let's say you're already on you're already running in a server partition mode and you're on a 64-bit Linux database server, you don't need to worry about, and you're not planning to switch to another type of database server in the process, then everything is going to be the same from that perspective, and you don't need to worry about how those pieces would be migrated. The other main way to look at this, and I'm just going to flip down to the next slide, is if you are switching OSs and or hardware. So first, let's taking a look at the if you're staying on the same platform, then you can run the pre-upgrade info script to figure out what objects what the upgrade process is going to look like. And perhaps Linus, you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it will point out some things that need to be done prior to running the upgrade. It will point out any obsolete initialization parameters. It'll tell you that you need to empty the DBA recycle bin. It'll give you some warnings if you have some issues with materialized views. There are quite a number of things that it could tell you about. So run the pre-upgrade information script. It's documented into the upgrade manual. It provides some additional information in the manual about some of the actions that you need to take, and prepares you for running DBUA. And let's see, that's on the upgrade. So when you do the upgrade, of course, there's an interoperability patch that's required. So follow the instructions in the note that we referenced the note ID right there, and it's a pretty involved document. So it's important that you follow the instructions. And there's an interoperability patch. There's a few other patches, the applications DBA, autoconfig templates patch, things like that. You'll be required to get on the latest developer, well, not necessarily the latest, but 18 at least. Or if you're going to do the upgrade, you may as well upgrade to patch set 19, which is the latest of it. And there are a set of about 6 or 8 patches also listed, additional patches, database patches listed in the interoperability note. And I'd recommend while you're at it to go ahead and apply the PSU. The latest PSU on 11.203, 11.203.4 actually supersedes 2 of the patches that are in that list, and it makes you have to apply like an overlay patch for one of them, a specific version. So get the PSU applied first, and it'll save you some work on the additional patches. And
I'm just kind of drawing. I'm just trying to draw a line right there. Not very well, but trying. To say that the bullets above that are really talking about things that you need to do to your existing home prior to at the beginning of the upgrade. And when you're upgrading database, basically you're installing a new Oracle home, and you're gonna, in the very simplest of ways of explaining it, you're installing a new Oracle home, and you're going to shut down the database in the old home, and you're going to start it up in the new home. And so the steps we're talking about above this line are ones that are to be done in the old Oracle home. The steps below this is really talking about getting your new Oracle home set up, and then some things that you need to do in terms of copying the admin utils things over to the new Oracle home. One other thing to note is that all of these steps presume that you are on 11.5.10.2 plus, and you're at a 10G database as a minimum starting point. If you're not at that minimum starting point, there may be other issues that you have to deal with to make sure that the interoperability pieces are sufficient in order to move forward with it. And then the last bit last bullet on there that's talking about test your custom code. There are a few small changes probably more than a few, but they're mostly small changes in the actual way in which SQL is interpreted and parsed. Not just in terms of the way the execution plans are generated in the database, but the actual syntax of it. So you may run into some errors within code if you have custom code. So you should test all of your custom code on an upgraded version of the Oracle element to make sure that it all works as you expect. Otherwise you may run into some changes. I know we've had other customers that were on this configuration, and they had significant amounts of customization, and when we did the testing, they did have rework that was required on their custom code, even just upgrading the database, not upgrading the apps. Just applying these interoperabilities and making sure that they got to the new database version still meant some rework. So test your code.
And it could change performance characteristics, so test performance too.
Correct. Yeah. Obviously, we did mention it. Obviously, you're changing database versions, but in particular, the optimizer, the way in which it works changes a bit between 10 and 11, and particularly 11.2. So beware that you may have code which suddenly the execution plans change on, or you may have code, particularly if you had code that had performance issues before, and you would put hints in it in order to make it behave the way you wanted it to. You may find that those hints are no longer the best way to do it. You may want to try it without the hints now and see if it works well without them. So, or you may need different hints in order to get the result you want. Next, we're going to talk about if you're upgrading the database and you do want to migrate the OS or the hardware platform. And this is kind of particularly true. There are a couple of things that have to do with the way in which, when you're migrating, if you're moving from a 32-bit OS to a 64-bit OS, there are certain considerations that you need to take into play. And also, if you're switching processors from one hardware class of processors to another, there are some things that you may need to take into consideration in terms of the way in which the data is actually physically stored or retrieved and stored as it's processed through the database. And that all of that in the end is going to net to, are your table spaces and your data files still viable in their current form, or do they need to go through some sort of a process or an import or export process in order to get them reorganized with data in the correct format inside the blocks? And obviously, if you're staying on the same hardware platform, the same version of the OS, then that's not an issue. But as soon as you say you're going to switch, those things may become in play. And Linus, do you want to walk through what some of these notes are talking about?
Yeah, so under certain circumstances, you can use things like transportable table spaces or transportable database. Some of the restrictions involve things like the Indianness, the difference in the Indianness of the platforms that you're going from and to. So pay particular attention to that, and you can you may find it using transportable table spaces or transportable database can be used to speed up the process.
I'm sorry, Linus, can you just say 2 words about what Indianness is? Make sure everybody knows.
Right. So there's what's called Big Indian architecture and Little Indian architecture platforms, and what the difference is where the most significant bit of a word is, if it's on the low end or the high end. And so if you transfer data between machines of different Indianness, then you have to transform the data based on that architectural difference.
So like an example would be if you were moving, say, from Intel to Solaris, right?
From Intel to
Spark.
To like I think the Spark is different, but I don't recall for sure. Yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that's an example. When you move from Intel to Spark, I think the example is that then the order in which the bytes are stored, or the most significant byte is stored in the bit is stored in a numeric value or in a word is flipped around, and that's the difference. So the result of that is then that in your data blocks, all the data needs to be kind of flipped around in terms of the way it's stored, and that's why if you are making that type of a migration, then obviously transportable table spaces and databases kind of go out because they rely on the fact that the data is still in the same format. And then you're going to be forced into something more like import-export.
Yeah, so the issue is that under certain conditions, transportable table spaces can be used between architectures of different Indianness.
Right.
So you just have to pay attention to the restrictions and look that up.
Okay. And then the other alternative is the import-export method, right?
Right, which there's a benefit to doing that because it can be used to reorganize your data. If that's one of the reasons you're thinking about doing it, however, remember that the OATM conversion will actually also reorganize your data, so it may be less important. Export-import also tends to be very time-consuming.
Right. So one option here that is, it's not really, I would say, recommended, but it's possible, is if you are migrating platforms and you need to go from non-OATM to OATM, you could actually derive what your OATM organization would be in test configurations, and then you can pre-stage that organization in an empty database and then use the import-export method to put the data in. And effectively doing that, you would be able to combine the database migration and the OATM pieces. But there's a number of, you're taking two steps, each of which has a significant degree of complexity, and now you're combining the two. So it's something that from a risk perspective, we usually recommend people break them into separate steps, move them and test them individually. I think the last part, there's a few patches that you're talking about, particularly if there's hardware OS platform migration, Linus?
Yeah, there are some patches that supply some scripts that aid in the export-import process. So you just get these, it's all in there's a note that Oracle publishes on the export-import process. It is noted in the middle of the document there, and you just follow the instructions, and it tells you to apply the patches for the process.
Okay. So, and I think we've talked a bit of the 32-bit to 64-bit already. Well, one of the main pieces in it is going to be the analytic workspaces. Linus, you want to tell them a little bit about that?
Yeah, if you have an EBS database, it has OLAP installed, and it's not directly upgradable. So you have to prepare your 32-bit database by exporting all of your analytic workspaces and dropping them. You have to delete them, and then you have to uninstall OLAP prior to starting the conversion. And then once your database is converted to 64 bits, you can install OLAP to 64-bit and import your analytic workspaces. And there's also the JVM has to be reinstalled.
After converting from one platform to another.
Correct.
Okay. Now let's move on to upgrading the apps themselves from 11i to 12.1.1. So there's a set of minimum patches which need to be applied before you can begin the process. You must have minimum ATG levels, and there's an AD prerequisite as well. So you want to make sure that you're at the minimum levels for that. Is there a particular note for that, Linus?
No, it's in the, if you get the, for instance, if you're upgrading to 12, planning to upgrade to 12.13, look in the documentation set. There's a manual called the R12 upgrade manual. It will tell you what you need to do in terms of patches, but it's not. There's not a lot. It's just you do need to make sure you have the ATG patch and its prerequisite. And there are a couple of others that you'll end up having to apply.
Right.
But it's all there.
Right. So I guess other than those patches, then you're pretty much just applying the upgrade patch itself to get to 12.11. The thing to recognize about that job is it's got over 100,000 worker tasks to it, and it takes quite a while to run. One of the main things that happens during that process is because subledger accounting has been implemented, subledger accounting needs to have a minimum amount of accounting in it for the transactions which have already been processed. So that minimum amount is basically, it takes the greater of the current year to date or 6 months of history. So if you're converting in at the end of March, it's going to take it's going to force you to create historical subledger entries for October, November, December of the prior year and January, February, March of the current year. If you're converting in September, it's going to force you to take January through September of the current year. That's the minimum you can take. You can actually set parameters during the upgrade process to control how much you take. And if you want to, you can take more than that in the cutover window. The good news is you don't have to take more than that, and you can go back and get more history converted after the cutover window. So after you're already live, there's jobs you can run to bring over more of that data from a historical perspective and end up with subledger transactions for them. The reason this is important is because if you needed to return an order or credit an invoice or receive a PO, any transaction which is open needs to have subledger accounting transactional data created for it in order to be referenced by another transaction that needs it. So you could easily end up in a scenario if you have longer order cycles or longer AR cycles that actually draw out over a period of time greater than the minimum required. So just pay attention to those things. The other thing to know is that these boundaries can be set module by module, and some modules, like as an example, Oracle AP, doesn't give you an option. It forces you to take all of the history for Oracle AP. So one of the things that you want to look at in addition to this is if there's any areas where you have historical data in an existing subledger like AP, AR, fixed assets, etc., where you don't need that data anymore, it would be a very advantageous time to look at doing an archive and purge of that older data, because it will streamline, it actually cause the upgrade process itself to run faster. And so that's something that you may want to look at. And if you were going to do that, you would be better served to take that all the way back if you haven't done the OATM yet, and do that as your first step, to do an archive purge, then do the OATM, then upgrade, and then run the process here. So those are the kind of things you may look at. But we've been at clients where they didn't think they wanted to do that, and then when they got into the process and they looked at what their cutover window was going to be just for this piece, just to do the 11i to 12.1 upgrade, and they're trying to shrink the time of it to make it fit in their outage window, and they found that they had to do purging in order to help with that. So that's another area that you're going to want to look at. And then the last step of the process is actually applying the 12.1 to 12.13 roll-up patches. And you just want to make sure that you've looked at the notes on this. There are some technical components that need to be upgraded as well within the middle tier stack. And Linus, why don't you tell us a little bit about those components?
Yeah, you get in 11i you have the 806 Oracle Home and the IAS Oracle Home. In release 12 you have the 10.1.2 Oracle Home, which is where your forms and reports XML publisher runs from, and then the 10.1.3, which is basically the Apache, the J2EE. Each of those have updates that Oracle keeps publishing, so it's a good idea to be proactive and get those updates applied as part of this upgrade, because if you don't, you could conceivably run into issues later on that would force you to do that upgrade later. So both the 10.1.3, the latest patch set for 10.1.3 is 10.1.3.5, and there's a 10.1.2.3 patch set available. Plus there's a bunch of one-off patches that they publish as well. So it can be a bit of a time-consuming process to do that because of all the patches involved, and it's part of the process.
Right. So, I mean, in the end of this, the last part of this is just the 12.1.3 roll-up patch. So you don't have to apply the 12.1.2 to get to 12.1.3. You just upgrade to 12.1, and then you can apply the last roll-up patch. But that roll-up patch has more than 22,000 worker jobs for it, and it runs quite a while all on its own. So, when you look at how long some of these things take, if it takes you, say, 24 hours to do an OATM upgrade or reorganization, and then let's say it takes you another between 12 and 24 hours to do the database upgrade, and then it takes, say, 24 to 48 hours to apply the 12.1, the 11i to 12.1 patching steps, and then another 12 hours to do the 12.1 to 12.1.3 patching steps. When you start to add all those up, you end up with something that in many cases won't fit into a single weekend or a single long weekend. And you start having to figure out what order you want to do them in and how you might want to break them up over, say, 2 or 3 outages. And that's all part of the planning that needs to go into or part of the activities that need to go into the planning for how you want to perform your upgrade. So the first thing you want to look at is that outage planning. The next one of the things you want to look at is looking at your system. You want to figure out that the migration of history for subledger accounting. How far back do you really need to have historical data converted so you can come up with a plan to get it converted? Usually what you find is that you can live with the minimum in the outage window, but if you do have transactions that go back further than that, you'll most likely need those all converted between the time you complete the initial conversion outage and before the time you get to your first period end close. So, if you convert at the beginning of a period, you're going to have 3 or 4 weeks to get the rest of that history run. But keeping in mind that now you're running that job as a regular, it's a concurrent request job, it's a time considered, there's workers to it, there's time consuming, it's a process consuming, it's a heavy process, and you're running this now on a live system, so you're competing for resources with your regular batch windows. So that's something that needs to be thought through as to how and when that history is going to get converted. If you can, or if you can set up any archiving for historical activities, and when and where that should be done in your process, like I said, you're probably most beneficial to figure out when what you could archive and archive it before, as step 1 of the entire process, because most of the other steps will benefit from the reduced volume with the archiving. And especially if you're going to do the reorganization after you've archived it, you'll get the maximum benefit of reorganizing the data after it's got extra stuff out of it. Things you do want to think about if you're going to do a hardware migration, the OS migration, whether you're going to be moving from 32 to 64-bit, and if you can, if and how you would benefit from virtualization. These are much more infrastructure type issues to be considered than they are just EBS upgrade. But if you're in the process of doing the upgrade, now would be the right time to look at how these things could be handled. And then they do have, as we just went through with the notes and whatnot, impacts in terms of what patches, what prerequisites, what approach you can actually take for moving databases, et cetera, from one area to the other during the upgrade process. That pretty much takes us to the end of our presentation. I'd like to open it up now for questions. If you have any questions, you can launch them on chat, or you can, I don't know, Beth, are the lines opened up so that participants can speak?
Yes, the phone lines are now open for questions. And you can also ask a question via chat or the Q&A portion.
Doesn't look like we have any questions.
Any questions?
If anybody has any follow-up things they think of or any other questions, our contact information is there on the screen. Any last comments, Sean or Linus?
No, I think we're all set.
Excellent. Well,
people should feel, as Bill said, people should feel free to reach out to myself
right.
or to Linus directly or to Bill if they have a question that they didn't get to ask here, or they think of one in a little bit, or if they want some help approaching this topic.
Absolutely. Well, Sean, Linus, great job. Thanks very much. And thank you for all the attendees for today's webinar.